Welcome to Season 4 of the Just Humans podcast, brought to you by the Scottish Centre for Crime and Justice Research and hosted by me, Rachelle Cobain. Welcome back, everyone. In this episode, I'm going to be talking to Nicola, Ceesay and Marguerite Schinkel about order for lifelong restrictions and the realities of living with a prison sentence with no end. Nicola, who spent the last few years researching order for lifelong restrictions as part of her PhD thesis, will explain why these sentences exist, and she'll tell us about the impact they've had on the people who are serving them. And also joining us today is Dr. Marguerite Schinkel, a senior lecturer in criminology at the University of Glasgow, who'll talk about her involvement in a social media campaign, #NoLR, and why she thinks it's time to end these kinds of prison sentences and focus on treatment rather than punishment. Nicola and Marguerite, welcome to the Just Humans podcast.
Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you.
So I'm going to come to you first, Nicola. Can you give a brief explanation about what order for lifelong restrictions are and what kinds of people are given these sentences?
The order for lifelong restriction became available to the High Court in 2006 after the introduction of various pieces of legislation, which essentially brought the new framework altogether. And these changes were on the back of recommendations that were laid out in a review undertaken by the McLean Committee in the year 2000, which was set up to examine and make recommendations for the sentencing and management of serious violent and sexual offenders. The OLR is a risk-based lifelong sentence with two parts, a custodial or punishment part expressed as a period of time, followed by a public protection element which may or may not include release on licence under conditions of supervision and monitoring. An important aspect of the OLR is that it's in place for life and only terminates when a person dies. And this sets it apart even from the automatic life sentence following a conviction for murder, where a person can apply, in theory, to have the supervision element of their licence terminated. The OLR can be imposed for a violent offence, a sexual offence, or an offence which endangers life, or the physical or psychological well-being of the public. And this is where it gets a bit complicated. So it can also be imposed where there's sufficient reason to believe that a person is at risk of carrying out an analogous offence in the future.
So how many people are given an order for lifelong restriction?
Around 279 persons have been given the sentence since it was introduced, and around 74% of those people are being held beyond the punishment parts of their sentence. Now, they won't be released until it's deemed safe to do so. And the last time I looked, only 24 people had ever been released.
Wow. So you could be a person who's in, like, let's say they're in the High Court, they get found guilty, and then they could be sentenced by a judge who says, right, your prison sentence is 8 years, that's your punishment part. But because you're also subject to this OLR, this order for lifelong restriction, that means that even after your 8 years is up, you still can't be released.
Well, you might get out after the 8 years or at the end of your custodial term, whatever that is. And that has happened. But I think the current data kind of speaks for itself. Although the thing to remember is that the OLR is a risk-based sentence. It's about managing the risk of future conduct. So it's not solely implemented as a punishment per se.
So if I can just come in here, one of the things I think is important about the order for lifelong restriction is that it turns out that the people who are given this order when they're in prison almost have to prove themselves that they are no longer a risk. So it's not that presumption against guilt, but it's a presumption for risk. So you're in prison and you might be mandated to be doing a program or to get some kind of intervention that's not available in that prison. And if you think about, like, our colleague Fergus McNeil's concept of the malopticon, right? Once you're in that situation, everything you do is framed in terms of risk. So as if It's as if almost your worst critic is looking over your shoulder at all the time and seeing everything you do and seeing everything in through that kind of lens. So that has a real consequence for whether you can get out of prison in the first place, but also then afterwards for the kind of society that you live in. Like, it's almost like a police state, right? Where anything that you do, anything that anybody else says about you could lead to you back in prison. But I have to say, in the terms of the OLR, that's something that hasn't happened that much because so few people have ever been released. So that experience is more something that I know from people who are on life license. But it's just a very, very different kind of way of looking at a person. And I don't know that any of us would do very well if we were assessed in terms of risk that way.
And if everything is judged through this lens of risk, what does that look like from the person who's having to experience an order for lifelong restriction? From your research, Nicola, what does the everyday reality look like? What can they and can't they do?
My sense from the research is that the experience is overwhelmingly negative, and a lot of that is due to that sense of being stuck in the system, seemingly unable to navigate those imperatives of risk that you have described. And I think that itself leads to a sense of hopelessness and despair. Most responses throughout the course of my research were characterised by a deep level of concern. But then that really comes back to what the OLR actually is, which is a whole life sentence. It's a symbolic and permanent marking of a person as the kind of ultimate danger. And I think that's the point that's not to be underplayed. And that's where that sense of hopelessness comes in. And if a person is subject to an OLR, then we have to be realistic about things like employment opportunities, normal things like making friends, having an intimate relationship, because a person subject to an OLR would have to disclose to another person that they're subject to an order.
And is that just even if you were like neighbours with someone, or you just meet someone at I don't know, like a training course? Do you have to tell everybody?
So any decisions that are made would be relevant to risk. So for example, if you had someone who had been convicted of a series of sex offences against intimate partners or intimate partner violence more broadly, then they would be expected in starting a new relationship with somebody else that the disclosure would be made. And then that opens up the other person to a whole raft of scrutiny, of agency intervention. So if the person, for example, had children, then the new partner would likely be subject to intervention by social services, because they would have to do contextual safeguarding of children in an environment where the person convicted of those types of offences may then be residing at the family home. And those are the types of things that would be considered in that case.
Do you think that people who are subject to order for lifelong restrictions can have a quote-unquote normal life in the community, or do you think that it's that this type of restriction actually just negates any possibility of a normal life?
I think it negates any possibility of having a normal life. That's my sense of how the sentence is vicariously experienced by practitioners, and knowing about those structures that are put in place in terms of disclosure, in terms of supervision and so forth. And I think the permanence of that almost renders a person a non-citizen. So this is referred to in the criminological literature as a carceral citizen. And in this case, when a person is subject to the order, they're permanently shaped and restricted, and they have to live with those enduring consequences.
But I think it's also, again, important to remember that at the moment, so few people have actually come out. So even though this order has been in place for a really long time, at the moment, the problem for most is not even managing a normal life in the community, but it is having any hope of being released.
Yeah, you can imagine that kind of hopelessness of never really seeing, light at the end of the tunnel. But I'm also thinking, this sounds like a really, really challenging sentence to have to live through, not just for that person, but obviously, their families too. But if you think about this from a victim perspective, I can also imagine people saying, this all sounds fair. This, nothing like if you're going to be a person who commits an exceptionally awful crime, then this is the only way to punish a type of person like that, is to produce a exceptional type of sentence. So if I can ask, what's so wrong with it then?
Well, I think the victim perspective is extremely important and sensitive for me as a researcher. Looking at some of the details of the cases was an emotional challenge. And I think one of the hardest things for me to reconcile during this PhD was the victim narratives that were coming out. And I think it was the late criminologist Nigel Walker who said, "The horns of the debate are sharpest when the harm caused is the type which destroys life or the quality of life." And I think as it stands, I think the OLR may provide a sense of justice and security for victims. However, there's another side to that, and that's an understanding that justice experienced people in general also have deep and enduring vulnerabilities themselves. So it raises questions about how do we develop early intervention strategies which seek to prevent those future victims, and not just through doling out orders for lifelong restriction or other preventive sentences, but through a better understanding of how the types of issues, whether they be intimacy deficits, addictions, adverse childhood experiences, trauma, or other vulnerabilities, actually contribute to harm. And how much of that is about asking the right policy questions? Do we have the breadth of resources that are required to support people on an OLR sentence in prison or in the community?
Marguerite, can I come to you and get your thoughts on that? I mean, do you think that where there's been an exceptional crime committed against someone, does an OLR fit that crime because it in itself is exceptional? Do you think there's a justification there?
Yeah, no. So I would also first say that not everyone on an OLR is an exceptional offender. So Lord Carlovay himself, he was until recently, the most senior judge in Scotland. He gave a presentation in 2014 in which he pointed out that OLRs may be imposed for a relatively minor offence, which of itself would not merit the imposition of such an order, including a first offender, for example, convicted of stalking, where there was no physical harm to the victim, theft, and breach of the peace, right? So there's also some minority report elements to this, and we've already said how difficult it is to predict risk. So people are looking at sometimes relatively minor offences, and then from that extrapolate risk into the future. And so I just want to make sure that we're not thinking about this as a completely separate group of people who are monstrous. They are people as well, like Nicola just said, people with pasts, and not always with very serious offending in their past, yet at least. And to what extent can we assess risk in that way? I think that's a question for a different debate, but obviously that is not an easy thing to do. And I'd also say that maybe we've gotten a bit addicted or caught in the idea that when harm happens, punishment follows. And this is beyond punishment. This is not, the punishment part is the punishment, but the rest of it shouldn't be about punishment, really, because it's not the punishment that the state has imposed, but it is so punitive. And I, for example, was abused myself as a very small child, and that definitely caused me harm. And there might be some place for some kind of keeping people safe or keep people safe from doing such things, but it shouldn't be years and years and years. There should be other ways of dealing with these things. And there are some of those are out there. And we also know that for victims, the criminal justice system going through that process can also be super, super difficult. So it's even called secondary traumatization, the way that you have to give evidence, the way that you're questioned, but also just a long waiting times where you don't know what's going to happen. So many cases are dropped as well. And I think our colleague Una Brooks has found that even people who've experienced sexual violence, she did research with them, and they said that even those for whom it had led to a conviction had sometimes wished they hadn't gone through the process in the first place. So I think we also shouldn't think that the criminal justice system and the punishment afterwards gives victims everything they need, because there's so much more that is needed as well that we have no way of dealing with.
And that's a really important point, actually, about the harm that's created beyond the crime, the harm created by the systems in place that are meant to provide justice actually might be doing some real damage to people.
There's also, and this is something that is well known within criminology, but it's also something that came up within my research, and is that, once we imprison the perpetrators of harm, actually it doesn't just contain the harm there, but the harm spreads like a contagion through the system and in and through people that work within the justice system. So, for example, in my research, practitioners spoke about the vicarious trauma of being exposed to certain crimes, the trauma of carrying the burden of blame, or a sense of fear and anxiety working with and supporting and caring for people who may or may not in the future go out and commit another act of harm. And so there's a deep sense of burden there for practitioners, and a fear of, I have to get this approach absolutely right. And what that does is that it tightens the noose of risk. The other harm that is evident is the harms of hopelessness, which are not only experienced by those subject to the OLR, but those persons who, again, are tasked with that care and management of people subject to the order, and a deep sense of despair. What can I do for this person? What can I tell him when he comes and asks this question? I can't provide support. I'm not just going to provide a flannel. It almost disempowers people. The kind of framework of risk disempowers people. And the bureaucratic burdens of more admin, more paperwork, more rational processes, which actually creates an absurd level of paperwork, process, procedure. And many people that I spoke to in the course of the research had said takes away from working with people subject to the order.
And if I can come in there, what's also really important to remember on that point is that the harm of somebody being imprisoned also spreads outwards to all the people in their lives. So the No Alar campaign was actually initiated by family members of people who are on OLRs, who also not only miss that person in their lives, brother, father, son. It's been mostly men, or almost only men, I think, who've been given OLRs. But also then have to live with that hopelessness, and it reflects back and forth. So, Nicola's quote and some of the quotes that came from an OLR campaign or themselves are that the hopelessness of the person in prison is really difficult for the people outside, and the hopelessness of the people outside, they try to hide that because it's really difficult for the person inside.
I mean, it's quite obvious that it is a far from perfect sentence, and we've talked about it's bureaucratic, it's disempowering, it seems to promote more of a sense of hopelessness than anything else. How do you change this then? So what would you do, Nicola, if I could give you the power to change OLRs? What would you do to make them actually work?
In terms of how would I change it within a current set of circumstances, I think it would be to resource the sentence properly in the first instance. And, it's all very well to say this is potentially the most dangerous group in society because that's what the OLR is meant to be for. But to lock people up without clear pathways to reduce risk, it seems antithetical to some of those large claims that are made about Scottish justice. And that, in my view, along with very good quality intervention, would reduce harm and potentially restore hope across the board.
So you're looking for more reform, clearer pathways, and something that just makes sure that people are well equipped, both staff and a prisoner is given the resources required to actually make progress. And Marguerite, what's your view? What would you do with an OLR if you could get your hands on it?
Well, I think I'd take a massive step back and actually look at all of society and how we think about what harm is, where it comes from, who's responsible, and how we should react to that. Because I don't think that harm is like, I think we are overly individualized. Like we take a whole situation and then take only one person out of that situation and blame it all on them, right? And in some cases of things that we call crime, that's more accurate, let's say, than others. But life is complex. People have complex lives, and harm is not always an individual problem. Like I know that the police have said several times now that they can't arrest everybody who's viewing child porn on the internet, because just so many people are doing that. And that's not something that is because all those people are individually evil, but because the internet's now available, right? And it makes it really easy, and there's this porn addiction and all this other stuff. So if we then just take the individual, then we're kind of missing the point. And so it's much more important to kind of tackle these issues at a societal level. So for example, one initiative that I'm aware of is Generation 5 in the United States, and that is taking a very serious offense, child sexual abuse, but taking a transformative justice kind of lens to it. And so their aim is to eliminate that abuse in 5 generations. So how might you do that? Not by locking up all the people who are child sex offenders forever, because there's always new ones in every generation, right? But through education, community dialogue, and also just being much more involved in what we think of as justice. So somebody commits a serious harm to somebody else, how do we cope with that as a community? Or do we just pass it on to the state and think that justice will be served, even though when we look into it, like in this case with OLRs, it actually makes no sense. Like people are just being locked up forever at huge expense as well. And the other thing I'd like to say there is, like, why do we feel so strongly that people who've done something like this need to be locked up, but we don't when people commit much larger harms, like the crimes of the powerful? Like if you think about Donald Trump just now, what he's doing to the world, he's actually should probably be imprisoned on our normal model for the things he has done himself interpersonally. But he's doing much more serious things, but nobody's going. And so are the leaders of oil companies. And, you know, you can go on and on and on, like companies that don't abide by health and safety, and people die horrible deaths just as much as they do in interpersonal violence. But nobody thinks, oh, we can't leave that person out here. We can't let that person make any future decisions because that's going to kill more people, even though it will. But we only think that in these cases where probably a lot of things came together, that somebody did something that harmed another person.
So it sounds like for you, it's not really about reforming one aspect of the criminal justice system. It's actually about rethinking the whole way in which society views those who deserve to be punished and those who don't. And if we do want to change things, you have to be able to start that conversation. And it seems with the campaign group No LR, it seems like that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to begin this conversation around order for lifelong restrictions. Marguerite, would you mind telling us a little bit about that campaign and what they're trying to achieve?
Yeah, so that is set up by the family members of people on OLRs, and they realized that people weren't coming out. Like this actually also took time because people got a punishment part, and then it obviously takes a long time to figure out that actually people feel like they're going to die in prison because they can't prove that they're no longer a risk. And so family members got together and started the No LR campaign. And we got in touch with them through the Coalition Against Punishment Scotland, which I'm a member of. And we decided that we could help set up a social media campaign, also involving students from the University of Glasgow who could offer some of their time. And that's where the social media campaign came from, which ran about a month ago. And that was a finite thing, but has created some more dialogue around the OLR, and people are talking to different kinds of media to amplify that.
Yeah, I mean, certainly when I saw the campaign kind of pop up in our own social media feeds, I thought I knew a bit about OLRs, but I hadn't quite appreciated how challenging it was. I think they had a couple of tweets that said OLR prisoners are less likely to get released than someone who's in prison for murder, which again I think really brings home this idea of how much more challenging it is for a person once they have an OLR. And there was another one that said there was an example of an OLR prisoner who'd had an 18-month sentence. So the punishment part was 18 months, but now they were facing this prospect of dying in prison because they just could not have that opportunity to progress, as Nicola was talking about, just is not there. And we know that conditions inside prison are already incredibly challenging. We've seen that again just a few weeks ago. We had the report out that more people are dying in custody now than ever before. A huge increase in prison-related deaths in the last year.
The OLR campaign also got the data on how many people have died on OLRs, and more people have died, whether in prison or in the community, after having served an OLR than who are now released in the community at the moment. So you can see where that hopelessness comes from.
I mean, I can't imagine how difficult it must be for a family member to have to witness your loved ones going through this kind of situation. And we did talk earlier about families themselves feeling helpless as well. What are families looking for in terms of reform and change? What are they proposing through this campaign?
They want to see the OLR sentence abolished, and for everybody who has that sentence now to be resentenced. And so they're not necessarily prison abolitionists at all, but they do think that there should be a different sentence and different kind of outcome for the people that they love and who are in prison.
My worry with that is that there are a lot of systems out there. So there's this great big trend towards risk-based punishment in Western jurisdictions, Anglophone jurisdictions, however you want to call it. And my fear would be that if we abolish something like an order for lifelong restriction, would there be political will to replace that with something else, something more punitive, something like the Americans have, where, 6,000 people have disappeared into institutions after their prison sentence have finished. And at the outset of their sentence, they had no idea that they were going to be subject to civil commitment. One of the reasons that the OLR came into being in the first place was due to concerns about persons designated as high risk circumventing a loophole in Scots law and being released from the state hospital. So basically there was public and political anxiety about the release of patients from the state hospital back in the 90s, and this provided a catalyst for the order for lifelong restriction. If we look at the history, we know this is where it came from. And so if we abolished the order for lifelong restriction, we gave everybody determinate sentences, and then something happened and it became high profile and it's all over the media and all over the tabloids, would we then see another knee-jerk reaction? A committee will be formed, proposals will be made, such as the way of it, and then something else will take the place of the order for lifelong restriction. Because as I say, the order for lifelong restriction really is embedded within these global trends towards using risk-based measures and risk-based measures of preventive punishment. So that would be my worry.
And there's that word again, risk, this common thread that's woven its way all the way through this entire episode, all the way to the end, even as we talk about how to improve and reform things, the risk that change can sometimes bring. But one thing we cannot risk is staying silent about the things we feel strongly about. And I'm so glad that both of you joined me today to talk about this subject from your own perspective, even though you don't totally agree on a way forward. I'm really hopeful that maybe this podcast has gone a little way to spreading the word about what order for lifelong restrictions are and what it really means to live under them. And if people want to find out more about the No OLR social media campaign, we can add a link to the show notes of this episode below. It's been great to speak to both of you, and thank you so much for being on the Just Humans podcast.
Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you.
If you want to find out more about us and our work, please visit the website sccjr.ac.uk.